The psychology of people who quietly escape the rat race. By 8:17 on Monday morning, the office was already alive. Coffee cups sat beside glowing monitors. Emails were stacking up. Someone was complaining about traffic. Someone else was talking about a deadline that should have been finished Friday. Everything looked exactly the way it had for years. Except for one desk. Michael Turner's chair was empty. No coffee. No jacket hanging over the back. No familiar face staring at two monitors while trying to answer messages faster than they arrived. Michael was 57 years old, and for most of his adult life, he had done almost everything he was told a responsible person was supposed to do. He built a career, bought a house, paid the mortgage, saved for retirement, accepted promotions, stayed late when the company needed him. And every morning he came back, until one Friday afternoon, Michael shut down his computer, picked up a small cardboard box, and walked out. When Monday came, he didn't return. Some coworkers assumed he had burned out. Others wondered whether something had happened at home. A few quietly asked the question people often ask when someone suddenly walks away from a good salary. How much money did he have? Maybe Michael had inherited something. Maybe an investment had paid off. Maybe he had finally accumulated enough to never work again. But none of those explanations quite fit. Michael wasn't secretly rich. He hadn't won the lottery. He wasn't moving to a beach in Florida. In fact, the most important part of Michael's departure had happened long before he left that building. Because Michael had been leaving for years, nobody noticed. Not his coworkers, not his manager. For a long time, not even Michael himself. His resignation on Friday was simply the last visible step in a psychological shift that had already changed the way he thought about money, success, time, and what made a life worth living. It started with questions so ordinary that Michael almost ignored them. Why did every raise feel exciting for a few months and then become normal? Why did every promotion seem to create another position he was supposed to want next? Why had the house that once made him feel successful eventually become another payment, another repair, another thing requiring his time? Michael had spent decades believing he was moving towards something, but somewhere in his 50s, a more uncomfortable question appeared. Toward what? There was always another target, another number, another purchase, another year of telling himself that life would become easier once he reached the next milestone. And the strangest realization wasn't that Michael disliked working. He didn't. It was that he could no longer remember when he had personally chosen the finish line he was running toward. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because Michael's story isn't really about quitting a job, and it isn't an argument that everyone should abandon a career, reject ambition, or sell everything they own. There are people all across America who never dramatically resign at all. They still work. They still pay mortgages. They still save money and make plans. From the outside, almost nothing about them appears unusual. But internally, something has shifted. They begin buying differently, working differently, comparing themselves to other people differently. Some stop chasing promotions they once desperately wanted. Some deliberately reduce their expenses. Others quietly build enough financial breathing room that saying no longer feels dangerous. And that's what makes these people psychologically interesting. They rarely wake up one morning and decide, I'm escaping the rat race today. The change tends to happen slowly. First, they begin questioning things they once accepted automatically. Then they discover that some of the rewards they spent years pursuing don't produce the lasting satisfaction they expected. Eventually, a distinction begins to form between having more and having enough. And once that distinction becomes clear, the entire race can start looking different. Because a person who believes they need more can always be persuaded to run another lap. A person who knows what enough means becomes much harder to motivate with the promise of the next reward. Psychologists have a useful concept for part of what Michael was experiencing: hedonic adaptation. Human beings have a remarkable ability to become accustomed to changes in their circumstances. Something that initially feels extraordinary can gradually become ordinary. Think about your first substantial paycheck, your first new car, or finally moving into a home you had wanted for years. At first, you notice everything. Then life absorbs it. The new salary becomes your salary. The new car becomes the car in the driveway. The bigger house becomes the place where you take out the trash. This ability to adapt can help us survive difficult circumstances, but it creates an interesting problem when we build happiness around constantly reaching the next external milestone. Michael had experienced it repeatedly. At 35, he wanted the office with the door. Eventually, he got it. For a while, walking inside felt like proof that all those late nights had meant something. Then the office became normal. Later came another promotion, a better salary, and a newer car. Each achievement delivered a burst of satisfaction, and then, quietly, the emotional baseline returned. The problem wasn't that achievement was meaningless. The problem was expecting achievement to permanently produce a feeling it was never guaranteed to sustain. So Michael responded the way many people do. He moved the target. Maybe the next salary would feel different. Maybe the next title would finally create security. Maybe once the mortgage balance dropped enough, then he would relax. But there was another force working on him: comparison. Human beings don't evaluate success in isolation. We look sideways. A salary can feel generous until someone similar earns more. A perfectly functional home can suddenly feel inadequate after spending enough time looking at larger ones. A career that once felt successful can begin feeling disappointing when a former colleague reaches a higher position. Psychologists call the broader phenomenon social comparison. And modern life gives us an almost endless supply of people against whom we can measure ourselves. There is always someone with a better kitchen, earlier retirement, larger investment account, more impressive vacation, or more prestigious job title. If your definition of enough depends on what someone else has, enough keeps moving. For Michael, the turning point arrived in a surprisingly ordinary place. He was sitting in his car one evening after work. The engine was off. His hands were still resting on the steering wheel. He had arrived home almost 20 minutes earlier, but he hadn't gone inside. Nothing catastrophic had happened that day. No one had fired him. There had been no dramatic argument. It had simply been another successful, exhausting day. And that was precisely what bothered him. Michael realized he was waiting in the driveway because he needed a few minutes to recover from the life he had worked so hard to build. Then his phone lit up. A calendar reminder appeared for the following morning. Another meeting, another deadline, another problem that would feel urgent until it was replaced by the next urgent problem. Michael looked toward his house and thought about something he had been saying for years. When things settled down, he would take the trip when things settled down, exercise regularly when things settled down, spend more time with people he cared about when things settled down, read again, walk more, sleep better. But suddenly he understood something uncomfortable. Things were not going to settle down by themselves. His life wasn't temporarily interrupting the life he wanted. This was his life. That realization didn't make Michael resign the next morning. In fact, almost nothing changed immediately. And this is where people who quietly escape the rat race often behave differently from the fantasy version of escape. Michael didn't storm into his manager's office. He didn't buy a camper van. He didn't post a dramatic announcement online. Instead, he opened his bank statements. He started asking a different question. Not how much more can I earn, but how much does my life actually require? That question sounds financial, but psychologically it was much bigger. For decades, increased income had been followed by increased expectations. Now Michael began reversing the equation. He kept his car longer. He became less interested in replacing things that still worked. Purchases that once represented success began looking different when he translated them into hours of his life. A monthly payment wasn't simply a dollar amount anymore. It represented time he would have to continue selling in order to maintain it. Gradually, his expenses became lighter. He increased his savings. More importantly, he created what psychologists studying motivation might recognize as greater autonomy, the sense that your actions are increasingly chosen rather than forced. Michael still worked, but the emotional relationship with work began changing because he was slowly reducing the consequences of walking away. That distinction matters. People sometimes imagine freedom as possessing enough money to do absolutely anything. But psychologically, freedom can also mean needing less from the things that control your choices. If your lifestyle requires every dollar of your paycheck, losing that paycheck can feel terrifying. If your identity depends entirely on your title, stepping away can feel like losing yourself. If your sense of worth depends on being admired, refusing the next promotion becomes surprisingly difficult. Quiet escape often begins by weakening those dependencies one at a time. Something else happened too. Michael stopped explaining himself. When coworkers talked about upgrading cars, he listened without mentioning that he had decided to keep his. When someone asked why he wasn't pursuing the next management position, he simply said he was happy where he was. This wasn't because he had discovered some secret superior way to live. He had simply realized that constantly defending his choices pulled him back into the comparison he was trying to escape. Other people were allowed to want more. Michael was finally allowing himself to decide what he wanted. And this is one reason the people who genuinely change their relationship with the rat race can be difficult to notice. They may not look rebellious. They don't necessarily reject work. Many continue working because work can provide purpose, relationships, structure, and satisfaction. What changes is the psychological contract. Work stops being the sole scoreboard for whether life is going well. Income remains important, but maximizing income is no longer automatically the highest objective. They begin protecting things that are harder to put on a resume. Mornings without panic, evenings with family, physical health, friendships, hobbies, control over their schedule, or simply the ability to sit somewhere without feeling that they should be accomplishing something. But there is a cost to this shift, and it's rarely discussed. Leaving a familiar definition of success can create uncertainty. If you have spent 30 years answering, "Who are you?" with your occupation, who are you when that occupation becomes less important? If achievement has been your primary source of validation, what happens when you deliberately stop competing? Some people discover that escaping external pressure forces them to confront internal questions they had been too busy to hear. Freedom does not automatically create meaning. It simply creates more room in which meaning must be chosen. That was something Michael had to learn. His first months after leaving weren't an endless vacation. On Monday mornings, he sometimes felt strange knowing his former coworkers were beginning their week without him. There were moments when he missed being needed. He missed solving difficult problems. He even missed parts of the routine he once complained about. But slowly, he built another routine. He woke without an alarm some mornings. He began walking regularly. He spent time on projects he had postponed for years. And eventually, he took on occasional consulting work, not because he had failed to escape, but because he discovered that the problem had never been work itself. The problem was believing he had no choice but to organize nearly everything around it. That may be the biggest misconception about escaping the rat race. The goal isn't necessarily to stop working. It isn't poverty disguised as enlightenment, and it isn't pretending money doesn't matter. Money matters enormously when it provides food, housing, healthcare, safety, and options. The psychological shift happens when money changes from being an endless scoreboard into a tool. Once basic needs and reasonable security are considered, the question becomes more personal. What is the additional money for, and what are you exchanging to obtain it? For someone, the answer may absolutely be worth the exchange. They may love building a company, advancing professionally, or pursuing wealth. For someone else, the additional income may no longer compensate for the additional stress, commuting, responsibility, or time away from people they love. There is no universal number called enough. That is precisely why quietly escaping the race is so personal. The moment someone else defines enough for you, another race has already begun. Remember Michael's empty desk on Monday morning? His coworkers saw a man who suddenly left. But there had been nothing sudden about it. The real departure began years earlier, when the reward stopped answering the questions he was asking. It continued when he stopped automatically upgrading his life every time his income increased. It accelerated when he stopped measuring himself against people running toward destinations he didn't actually want. And it became possible when he built enough financial and psychological room to choose differently. Michael hadn't beaten everyone else to the finish line. He had stopped believing there was only one finish line. And perhaps that is the psychology behind people who quietly escape the rat race. They don't necessarily become less ambitious. They become more selective about what deserves their ambition. They stop asking only, "How much can I achieve?" and begin asking, "What is this achievement costing me?" They stop assuming more is automatically better and begin deciding what enough means before the world decides for them. So here's a question worth sitting with. If nobody could see your house, your car, your job title, your clothes, your vacations, or your bank balance, how much of what you currently want would you still want? There is no correct answer. But your answer might tell you whether you're running towards something you chose, or simply running because everyone around you is moving. If this gave you a different way to think about success, subscribe and turn on notifications. We explore the hidden psychology behind the choices people make, the habits they repeat, and the lives they build without always realizing why. And tell us in the comments, what does enough look like to you? Because maybe escaping the rat race doesn't begin when you finally walk away from your desk. Maybe it begins the moment you decide where you actually want to go.